The warm golden sun had begun to dip in the sky, casting a soft glow across the front yard. It was one of those rare afternoons when everything seemed to fall perfectly into place. The grill was sizzling. The smell of marinated meat wafted through. The air, and Aiden, my 11-year-old son, was outside, thoroughly immersed in his own world. He had his remote-control 4x4 truck racing across the lawn, sending it over ramps he had built out of bricks and wooden planks. His laughter, a sound of pure joy, echoed in the air every time the truck collided with a sprinkler head, sending a burst of water into the air. It was a simple moment, but a perfect one. My wife Rachel had taken our baby daughter to the farmer's market, and for a brief moment, everything felt like it was exactly where it needed to be. I was inside the house, preparing for the BBQ, brushing, seasoning onto steaks, and setting the table with plates and napkins. The sizzling sound from the grill added to the peaceful ambiance, a reminder that the weekend was finally here. Everything seemed to be falling into place. But then the doorbell rang. The chime was sharp and something about it instantly felt wrong. I turned toward the kitchen door with a sinking feeling, setting the brush down. A sense of unease washed over me, and a chill ran down my spine. I made my way to the front door and opened it. Standing there, as if they had been waiting for the right moment to strike, were 3 members of the Homeowners Association, HOA. They stood in a line, staring at me with expressions that were all business. Not one of them smiled, not a word of greeting, just hard stares and an air of authority that I wasn't in the mood to entertain. "What can I do for you?" I asked, trying to remain cordial, but my voice betrayed a hint of suspicion. One of the men, a tall and imposing figure in a navy blue polo, stepped forward. His arms crossed over his chest as if he were already in the midst of some sort of power struggle. Without introducing himself, he got straight to the point. "Your son, the one playing with the remote control truck, what is that noise? It's disturbing the peace and violating HOA guidelines." I blinked, unsure if I had heard him correctly. My first thought was that I must have misunderstood. "Excuse me?" I replied, trying to make sense of the accusation. "What's wrong with him playing with his truck? It's just a toy." "Your son is violating the HOA rules about outdoor activities," the man responded, his voice thick with disapproval. "It's too loud. It's a disturbance to the neighbors, and that's unacceptable. We have strict guidelines about noise levels, especially on weekends." I stood there, utterly stunned. This was absurd. I tried to process what was being said. A child playing in his own yard with a toy truck was now somehow breaking rules? I glanced over my shoulder at Aiden, who had stopped playing when the HOA members arrived. He was standing frozen in the corner of the yard, clutching his controller. Tightly, his face a mix of confusion and concern. He was so much like me in that moment. When you're a kid, you never expect something like this to happen. You don't expect to be scolded for playing outside. The man continued speaking, but I couldn't focus on his words anymore. My mind was racing, the absurdity of the situation settling in. Was this really happening? Was I really being called out for something so trivial? I had to fight the urge to raise my voice. I took a deep breath, my hands clenching at my sides. This wasn't just about the truck. No, this was about something deeper, something more personal. They were intruding into my space, into my family's time, and for what? A petty complaint. About a toy? I wanted to step outside and say something sharp, but I knew that wouldn't help. Instead, I stood there silently, my gaze shifting between the HOA members and my son. Aiden was still standing, rooted to the ground, looking more and more nervous by the second. It hurt me to see him like that. His face, which had been lit up with joy just moments ago, was now shadowed with uncertainty. This wasn't just some misunderstanding anymore. These people weren't just overstepping. They were harassing my child. The second member of the HOA, a woman with an air of superiority and an overzealous need to assert her power, spoke up. We've had multiple complaints about noise levels, and it's been escalating. This is your warning. You need to get this under control immediately." Her tone was cold, condescending, and her words were like a slap to my face. My pulse quickened as I processed the injustice of it all. This was supposed to be a time for relaxation, a break from the everyday grind. But now, it was being ruined by these strangers, these people who felt they had the right to dictate how my family spent our free time. I was about to speak, but the words were caught in my throat. I took another deep breath, trying to center myself. This wasn't the moment to lose control. I had to think clearly. They were standing there, trying to intimidate me, trying to impose their will on me and my family. They didn't know who they were messing with, but I wasn't about to let them break me. Not now. Not when my son needed me to stand firm. In a calm voice, I finally replied, "My son is playing with his toy truck. There's no harm in it. He's not disturbing anyone." I paused, locking eyes with the woman who had spoken. "If you have a problem with the noise, I suggest you take it up with the other neighbors. But right now, this is my property, and my son is simply enjoying his afternoon." I could feel the tension mounting as I spoke, my words firm and measured. The third member, a younger man who had been standing silently, finally chimed in. "Sir, we don't want to escalate this. We're just trying to enforce the rules. If you don't comply, there could be fines. You need to put a stop to this immediately." He glanced at Aiden, who was still standing in the corner of the yard, visibly upset. My heart sank as I realized that they were threatening my child's simple happiness. Something inside me snapped. I couldn't stay silent anymore. The image of my son, looking lost and scared, had broken me. I was done. This wasn't just about a toy truck. This was about my family, my home, and my right to protect them. The trespassing strangers in front of me had no idea who they were dealing with, no idea what I had been trained to handle. But I didn't raise my voice. I didn't let the anger take control. Instead, I smiled. It was a calm smile, but one that held a deep sense of understanding. They had no idea who they were messing with. I'd been trained to handle far worse situations than this. I'd been a Secret Service agent, after all, trained in dealing with threats of all kinds, protecting presidents, and navigating tense and volatile situations. These HOA members, with their petty complaints, didn't stand a chance. The next few moments would be critical. How I responded would determine the direction this interaction took, and I wasn't going to let them have the upper hand. Not with my son standing there. Not today. The world seemed to slow down as I stood there in front of these HOA members, the tension thickening with each passing second. In the heat of the moment, I found myself temporarily immobilized, processing what was happening with a deep sense of disbelief. Here I was, standing in my own front yard, defending my son's simple joy of playing with a remote control truck. The situation was beyond absurd. My son, Aiden, who had been so happy just moments ago, was now standing quietly in the corner of the yard, a victim of their intrusive rules. They didn't see it. They didn't see the innocence of it all, the pure, carefree enjoyment of a child. All they saw was a violation, the kind of violation that could be slapped with a fine. The thought alone was ridiculous. How could playing with a toy truck on your own property with no harm to anyone else be wrong? It wasn't just absurd, it was infuriating. And yet, there I stood, with these so-called enforcers of order trying to bully me into submission. The sense of anger that surged within me was almost overwhelming, but I forced myself to remain calm. It was the only way. It was the only choice. The best way to deal with people like this, people who were drunk on their own sense of authority, was to show them that I wasn't going to react like everyone else. I wasn't going to let them push me around. Not today. Not while my son was standing there looking more confused and frightened with every word they spoke. I gave them a smile, It wasn't an angry smile or a smug smile, but one that conveyed something far more dangerous, a quiet, calm confidence. The kind of confidence that said, "You don't know who you're dealing with." I could feel the weight of their gaze, the way they were trying to size me up, trying to figure out how they could break me. But they didn't have a clue. They didn't know who they were messing with. For the past decade, I had been a Secret Service agent. Not the type of agent who sits in an office all day writing reports, but one who had been on the front lines, protecting high-profile individuals, including 3 U.S. presidents. I had been trained in high-stress situations with threats coming from every direction. I had been taught to stay calm in the most volatile circumstances, to read a situation in a split second, and to act decisively when necessary. I knew how to diffuse a tense situation without escalating it, how to use my words and my presence to gain control. The people in front of me, with their petty complaints and their inflated sense of importance, had no idea what they were dealing with. They thought they could push me around because they wore the badge of the HOA. But what they didn't know was that I had been trained to deal with far more dangerous situations than this. They were amateurs, trying to act like they were in control of something they had no real understanding of. This wasn't about a truck or noise, it was about power and control, and they were about to learn that they were no longer in charge. They continued to argue. I didn't interrupt them. I let them talk, let them get more and more flustered as they realized that I wasn't going to give them the reaction they were looking for. They were used to people caving under pressure, used to getting their way because of the fear they instilled in homeowners. But I wasn't afraid of them. In fact, the more they tried to intimidate me, the more I began to enjoy watching their frustration grow. Aiden, who had been standing in the corner of the yard, finally spoke up. His voice was small, hesitant, but I could tell he was trying to understand what was happening. "Dad, am I in trouble?" I turned to him, my heart breaking for the confusion and fear in his eyes. He had done nothing wrong. He had simply been a child playing with a toy. But in that moment, he was being treated like a criminal. I knelt down beside him, my hand resting on his shoulder as I spoke softly, reassuring him. "No, son, you're not in trouble. These people are just confused." As I looked up at the 3 HOA members, I could see the shift in their demeanor. They had expected me to break, to yell, to argue. They thought that by making me feel small and powerless they could win. But I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction. I wasn't about to let them take control of my life or my family. One of the members, a woman with a sharp, condescending tone, stepped forward and pointed to Aiden's truck. "This needs to stop now. We've warned you before and we're not going to let this go." I stood up, my eyes meeting hers. I didn't flinch. I didn't back down. "You don't get to decide what my son can and can't do in his own yard," I said firmly. "This is not a violation. This is a child playing. You have no right to impose your rules on something so harmless." Her face reddened, and I could see the gears turning in her mind as she tried to come up with a response. But there was nothing she could say. The more she spoke, the more she sounded ridiculous, and she knew it. But she wasn't ready to admit defeat. Instead, she glanced at her colleagues, hoping for backup. But all they could do was stand there, silently watching the situation unfold. The tension in the air was thick, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on all of us. This wasn't just about a toy truck anymore. It was about respect. It was about standing up to people who thought they had the right to control your life, and I wasn't about to let them win. In that moment, I could see the fear starting to creep into their expressions. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected someone who wasn't afraid of them, someone who had the confidence and composure to stand their ground. I could almost feel their uncertainty. They had crossed a line, and they knew it, but they still didn't know how far I was willing to go to protect my family. The woman opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off before she could say another word. "You can leave now," I said, my voice calm but firm. If you don't have a valid reason for being here, you need to leave. I won't ask you again." She froze, her mouth hanging open as if she had never been spoken to this way before. For a brief moment, she hesitated, unsure of what to do. Then, without a word, she turned to her colleagues and motioned for them to follow her. They all started to walk away, but not without shooting one last glance back at me. I stood there, unwavering, watching them leave. They weren't going to get the best of me. Not today. As they walked away, I turned to Aiden, my heart swelling with pride. He was still unsure of what had just happened, but I could see the relief on his face. He didn't know the full extent of what had transpired, but he knew one thing for sure: he was safe. I had his back, and I would always protect him, no matter what. I glanced at the grill, the steaks still sizzling away. It was time to get back to what mattered: my family. I took a deep breath and walked back to the grill, the calm of the moment settling over me once again. I had faced down the HOA, and I had won. But more than that, I had shown my son that standing up for yourself and your family is always the right thing to do. And that, in the end, was the most important lesson of all. The air between us thickened with every passing second, charged with tension, as I stood facing the members of the Homeowners Association, HOA. They were so sure of their power, their sense of authority. Yet in that moment, they were unaware of the storm brewing beneath my calm exterior. My eyes flickered toward Aiden, still standing in the corner of the yard, clutching his remote control, truck in his small, trembling hands. This wasn't just about a toy, and I knew it. It was about respect, about boundaries, and about protecting my son. The stakes had shifted. This wasn't merely a dispute over noise. It had become a matter of principle, one I wasn't going to back down from. I turned back to face the 3 HOA members, my fingers gripping the barbecue tongs tightly. I could feel the metal's weight in my hand, but it wasn't the tool itself that grounded me. It was the quiet confidence that had always guided me through the toughest of situations. The grilling spatula and tongs I held in my hand felt like an anchor in the middle of a storm, a symbol of my resolve to stay calm, stay in control. Everything inside me screamed to challenge them, to tell them just how wrong they were. But I had learned long ago that a calm, deliberate approach was always the best strategy. They were still going on about their rules, their demands, their sense of entitlement. They continued to argue, telling me that my son's toy truck was disturbing the peace, that I needed to follow the HOA's guidelines. I hadn't read their rules thoroughly, to be honest. I had received their letters, yes, but I had tossed them aside, dismissing them as bureaucratic nonsense. At first, I hadn't taken them seriously. But now, standing in my yard, facing these people who seemed so ready to overstep their bounds, I realized how wrong I had been to ignore them. This was no longer about following guidelines. This was about defending my home, my family, and my rights as a parent. As they spoke, their voices growing louder, I felt my temper flaring just beneath the surface. It was hard to listen to their pompous tone, their insistence that they were right, that they had the authority to dictate how my son played. I looked over at Aiden again. His small face was pale, and I could see the confusion in his eyes. Why were they doing this? What had he done wrong? His innocence in that moment reminded me why I had to stay calm, why I couldn't let myself be pulled into the kind of confrontation they were trying to instigate. They were trying to make this about something as trivial as noise, but I knew better. This was about something much bigger. It was about control. I took a deep breath, exhaling slowly to steady myself. The stillness of the air around me was deceptive, hiding the undercurrent of anger that simmered beneath the surface. It would have been so easy to snap, to shout at them, to tell them to leave, to demand that they never set foot on my property again. But I knew that wouldn't help. If I let them see my anger, they would have the upper hand. They were looking for a reaction. They wanted me to back down, to apologize, to cower under the weight of their so-called rules. But I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Not today. I stepped closer, maintaining eye contact with each of them, one by one. I wasn't angry, at least not outwardly, but my gaze was firm, unyielding. I had to make them understand that they were in the wrong and that they were messing with someone who wasn't afraid of confrontation, someone who had experience handling far more difficult situations than this. I could see the confusion in their eyes as I took a step forward. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected someone to stand their ground in the face of their empty threats. One of the men, the younger one, spoke up again, this time with a slightly softer tone, as though trying to soften the confrontation. "Look, sir, we don't want to make a scene. We just want you to understand that this kind of behavior—" "You don't know who you're messing with," I interrupted, my voice quiet but firm. The words hung in the air for a moment as I let them sink in. There was no anger behind my voice, but there was something else, a certainty, a quiet power that made them pause. I could see them processing my words, trying to figure out how to respond. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't escalating the situation. But in that simple statement, I was making it clear that I was not someone they could easily push around. I had spent years in high-pressure situations, assessing threats, managing crises, and keeping calm under duress. I wasn't some homeowner who would buckle under the weight of their threats. I wasn't someone who would be intimidated by their words or their rules. The older woman who had been leading the charge blinked, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The silence between us felt thick, the kind of silence that only happens when someone realizes they've misjudged a situation. It was as if the wind had stopped blowing, and the world had frozen for just a moment. They didn't know how to respond. They were used to homeowners complying, to people submitting to their authority without question. But they had never dealt with someone like me before. I could see the hesitation in their eyes now. They were trying to figure out how to salvage their position, how to regain control of the situation. But I wasn't about to let that happen. I wasn't going to let them continue to bully me or my family, not when I knew they had no real grounds for their demands. I took another step forward, making sure they understood the seriousness of the moment. "I'm not going to let you bully my son, and I'm not going to let you bully me. You have no right to dictate what my son can and can't do in his own yard. This is my property, and I will decide what happens here, not you." The younger man opened his mouth as if to protest, but I cut him off. "If you want to continue this, fine. But understand that I won't back down. You're trespassing on my property, and you're threatening my son for doing nothing wrong. That's not something I'm going to take lightly." They were visibly uncomfortable now, shifting on their feet, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The older woman, who had been the most vocal, glanced at her colleagues, as if searching for some kind of reassurance, but all she found was silence. They had no response, no argument that could refute my calm, clear assertions. They had come to intimidate me, but it was clear that they weren't prepared to handle someone who wasn't afraid of them. I could feel the power shifting in my favor. The momentum of the confrontation had swung, and they were beginning to realize that they had lost control of the situation. They weren't used to being challenged. They weren't used to someone standing up to them with such quiet confidence, without anger or hostility. I could almost hear their wheels turning as they scrambled to figure out how to get out of this situation without further embarrassing themselves. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice quieter now, almost defeated. We'll take this up with the other neighbors." She was grasping for some way to save face, but it was too late. The damage had been done. They had overstepped, and they knew it. I nodded, a silent acknowledgement that the battle was over. "You do that," I said, my voice still calm, still firm. "But don't come back here unless you have a valid reason." They didn't say another word. They turned and walked away, their heads slightly bowed in defeat. I watched them go, my heart pounding with the rush of victory. I had stood my ground. I had protected my family from their overreach, and I had done it without raising my voice or losing control. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. In that moment, I knew that no matter what happened, I had proven that I wouldn't let anyone, no matter how much authority they thought they had, push me around. As I watched them walk away, I turned back to Aiden, who had been standing in the same spot the entire time. His face was no longer filled with confusion or fear. It was lit up with a small, relieved smile, as if he finally understood that everything was going to be okay. I walked over to him, bending down to his level. "It's all right, buddy," I said, my hand resting on his shoulder. "You're safe. No one's going to hurt you." He nodded, still holding his truck, but now his eyes were filled with admiration, as if he had learned something important in those few minutes. He didn't need to know the details of what had happened, but he knew one thing for sure. He had a father who would stand up for him no matter what. As I stood up, I glanced over. At the grill. The steaks were done, and it was time to finally sit down and enjoy the evening. The battle had been fought, and I had won. It wasn't about a toy truck or noise anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, for protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and for teaching my son the most important lesson of all: never back down when it comes to defending what matters most. The situation had reached its boiling point. Tension hung heavy in the air like a thick fog, making it difficult to focus. It was clear that the HOA members weren't going to leave without some kind of resolution, but the truth was, there was no resolution to be had. Not from their side. I had nothing to prove to them. They had nothing legitimate to stand on. As I stood there, hands still gripping the barbecue tongs, my mind raced. The words they had used to justify their intrusion had fallen flat. The more they spoke, the more their argument crumbled under the weight of its own absurdity. I knew I had to act swiftly. I had already been calm, composed, and resolute in my stance, but now it was time for the final push. I turned my attention to my phone, pulling it from my pocket as I dialed a familiar number. My fingers hesitated slightly on the screen, but only for a brief moment. I wasn't about to let these HOA members have the last word. I wasn't about to let them leave with the sense that they had won. I needed backup, and I needed it now. The phone rang 3 times before the voice on the other end answered. "Hello?" "Hey, it's me," I said, keeping my voice steady but with an underlying edge of urgency. "I need a favor. I've got some unwanted guests here. They're causing trouble, and I need the local law enforcement to pay a visit." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a soft chuckle. "Trouble with the HOA?" "Yeah, that's right. They're trespassing, harassing my son over a toy truck. It's gotten out of hand, and I need them to back off. I could use a little help." I could hear the smile in his voice now. "Understood. I'll make sure the right people show up." As I hung up the phone, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't handling this alone anymore. I had people I could rely on, people who understood the importance of standing up for what's right. The HOA members, for all their bluster, hadn't accounted for one thing: the kind of person they were dealing with. They thought they could push me around because they were accustomed to people caving under pressure. But they hadn't realized that I had been trained for much more difficult situations. They weren't used to someone who could turn the tables on them without breaking a sweat. I looked over at Aiden, who was still standing in the corner of the yard. His wide brown eyes watched me carefully, full of concern. I gave him a reassuring smile, though I knew he still didn't completely understand what was going on. He didn't need to know the details. I just wanted him to feel safe again. He had seen enough already. The tension, the voices raised in argument, the strangers in our yard. It was a lot for any child to take in. I could see the uncertainty, in his expression, the lingering doubt. But I would make sure that he never had to feel that way again. Not on my watch. The moment I turned my back to check on the HOA members, I knew they were growing more uncomfortable. The initial wave of authority they had walked in with had been replaced by confusion and hesitation. I had made my point, and they were beginning to realize it. I wasn't the kind of person who took threats lightly. I wasn't the kind of person who would allow anyone, no matter how much power they thought they had, to walk all over me. I took a step closer to the grill, my back still facing them. I didn't need to look at them to know that they were starting to crack under the pressure. I could feel their unease, the way they shifted from foot to foot. They had no response to what I had said. They didn't know how to handle someone who wasn't afraid to stand up to them. They had met their match. It didn't take long before the unmistakable sound of sirens reached my ears. It was distant at first, but it steadily grew louder, until it was right outside my driveway. I didn't have to turn around to know that the police were here. I felt a sense of relief wash over me as the sound of the approaching sirens rang in my ears. It wasn't just about the police showing up. It was about making a stand. It was about proving that no one could intimidate me, that no one had the right to treat my family like this. The HOA members hadn't even realized what was coming. As the police car rolled up the driveway, its lights flashing brightly against the fading daylight, I felt a surge of satisfaction. It was the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing you're doing the right thing, from knowing that you've stood firm in the face of adversity. The officers stepped out of their vehicle, their uniforms sharp, their presence commanding. There was no mistaking the authority they carried. As the officers made their way toward the front door, the HOA members fell silent. They didn't know how to respond. They had been so sure of themselves just moments ago, but now, faced with the reality of law enforcement, they were at a loss. The older woman, who had been the most vocal, tried to speak, but her words faltered in her throat. She glanced nervously at her colleagues, looking for someone to back her up. But there was no support coming from them. They were all in the same position, unsure of what to do, unsure of how to salvage this situation. The officers approached me first, one of them giving me a nod of recognition. "Everything okay, sir?" "Now it is," I replied, my voice steady. "These folks have been harassing my son, trying to enforce rules that don't apply. I need them to leave." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable but firm. "Understood," one of them said. He turned toward the HOA members, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. "You need to leave. You've been asked to go. If you return, without a legitimate reason, we'll have to take further action." The HOA members tried to argue, but the officers weren't having it. They spoke briefly with the HOA members, their voices low, but I could see that the conversation was one-sided. The HOA members were losing their grip, their power slipping away with each passing second. They had been trying to intimidate me, but now they were the ones who had to back down. As the officers finished speaking with them, the HOA members slunk away, their heads low, defeated. They had no more arguments, no more complaints. They had been shown for what they truly were, bullies who had picked the wrong person to mess with. It didn't matter if they were from the HOA with their so-called authority. They were powerless in the face of someone who had the will to stand up for what was right. I didn't say anything as they walked away, my gaze fixed on them as they left my property for good. I didn't need to say anything. They knew they had lost. They knew they had been defeated. And I knew in that moment that I had sent a message loud and clear. Never mess with someone who has the training to protect what matters most. As the last of the HOA members left the yard, I turned to Aiden. His smile had returned, albeit a little shy. He was still processing what had happened, but he could tell that everything was going to be okay now. I walked over to him, kneeling down to meet his gaze. "It's over now, buddy. You're safe." He nodded, his eyes bright with relief. It wasn't just about the truck or the HOA. It was about something deeper. It was about knowing that no matter what happened, I would always have his back, that I would always be there to protect him, to stand up for him. As I stood up and turned, Back to the grill, I felt the weight of the situation finally lift. The victory wasn't just about the HOA or the police. It was about ensuring that my family was safe, that my son could play freely in his own yard without fear of intrusion. It was about sending a message that would resonate with anyone who thought they could take advantage of us. As the police car drove off into the distance, I knew that this chapter had come to a close. The HOA had been shown their place, and I had proven to myself and to my son that standing up for what's right is always worth it, no matter the cost. If you've ever felt powerless against the system, it's time to take a stand. Subscribe to the HOA Stories for more real-life stories of standing up for what's right.